And one of the big topics I want to get into with is, of course, your podcast, The Energy Equation. The term energy is something that everyone listening to this will maybe have like a different feeling or reaction towards. They'll think like, oh, I'm a high energy person. And if you listen to me when I'm caffeinated on the podcast, you think I'm very high energy. Or if you watch me in a sales pitch, I'm very high energy.
Yeah.
But energy fluctuates massively. And I wonder if we were to get into that, how would you define energy in general terms?
Yeah, I think any definition I give it in general terms will meet some people's expectation but fail others. So I define energy in the sense of how other people frame it. I think we have to go back and say, look, there are 4 real domains of which I will express my energy. The first is my physical energy. So if I take, and we do this on the energy equation, we ask people to rate their energy 0 to 100. And that's the only score I'm really interested in, because your perception of your energy is all I'm working with. I'm not going to tell someone who's got an energy score of 95 that they need to do other things. I'll be like, oh my God, how do I get a 95? So start with the idea of physical energy would be my ability to complete all the tasks that I would want to complete. And, that's, I've got the energy to exercise, I've got the energy to prep my meals, I've got the energy to get out of bed without hypercaffeinating, I've got the energy to get myself into bed when I've got that early stages of fatigue. I sort of don't feel rate limited in my physicality. And a good expression of that would also be immunity. Your immune system and your physical energy are so
how susceptible we are to disease or little bugs here and there.
Exactly right. And the same immune system that resists the bug or gets you over the 2-day cold versus the 5-day cold is the same immune system that's mopping up early cancer cells, preparing blood vessel walls for cardiovascular disease. So
it's a great indicator.
Great indicator. And your immune system is a very early barometer of inadequate energy. And most people will get that, right? But and we can look at that in really sort of clinical terms by discussing herpes, which is always a fun topic to get into. But herpes simplex, is the traditional virus people get if they're lucky enough to snog someone, or you can get it through not kissing, but I think that's much less fun. You can get it off a toilet seat, whatever you're doing. You can get it loads of different ways, but when you get it, you've got it, right? So herpes simplex sits in the cells of your body as a chronic viral infection, and it is held within the cells by the quality of your immune system. When your immune system's not there, it manifests as a cold sore, right? So you get lots of people going, oh, I get a cold sore when I'm run down. Like, well, what do you mean by run down? They're like, well, excessive stress, lack of exercise, lack of diet, lack of sleep. And what you've got there is all the mechanisms that preserved your physical energy have depreciated, and your body then can no longer hold that herpes simplex in the cell. You get a cold sore, and that's an incredible early warning sign that you should respond to, not by covering it in Zovirex and managing the symptom, but by addressing the behaviors that let your immune system slip. So physical energy will be everything from, can I train, can I cook, is my immune system robust? But that's not the only source of energy. Your ability to think strategically, your cognitive clarity, your
to be verbose, to be articulate, to be able to recall things as well.
100%. So your people will know when they've got that sort of brain fog that has a time with physical energy, but also when we're under the cosh, it's not a great time to make a big decision. We say don't divorce your spouse when you're tired. Don't decide to leave a job that you did once love that you now don't seem to love because you're exhausted. But cognitive energy really is my mental growth, my clarity of thinking, more strategic versus reactive. And that's, again, another thing I could scale 0 to 100. I could also scale my emotional energy and say, am I able to harbor difficult relationships, not just good ones? And good ones are great, but if I surround myself with just good ones, I end up where I found lots of my clients over the years.
Emotional regulation is such an important skill, but as you say, if our energy level isn't there, we have less bandwidth to handle it.
100%. And so and all of these things you'll see are expressions of energy. They're also sources of energy. So what we get is when you've got low emotional energy, you might not be ringing the parent that you need to ring. You might not be going to the social event that you feel you haven't got the energy to socialize, and we all know that when you do go there, most people fill their cup rather than empty it. And then the fourth domain of energy would be sort of spiritual energy, which aligns to not faith or God, but purpose. So, what's the point in me existing? Why am I here? Do I do any good? Am I contributing? And that contribution could be my own personal growth. It could be, things that don't have great philanthropic meaning, but they mean something to me. And so when we look at does someone have good energy, we can sort of take a snapshot of 0 to 100, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. And if those numbers are lower than the individual wants, then I've got an incentive to improve their energy. If those numbers are where they want them to be, then we just keep doing what you're doing because the formula's working.
Yes, and as long as you can work out what habits are contributing towards that at that moment in time, because sometimes something slips in somebody's routine or changes, and they there's like a lag effect
Yes.
of when the challenge kicks in.
Agree.
For example, I'm in London today, travelled from Clapham this morning across to Hackney where we're sat in the studio.
Awesome.
On the Northern Line, incredibly busy.
Yes.
My commute in Glasgow when I'm there or in Dubai when I'm there is radically different.
Yeah.
So when I'm on my way to the studio, I don't have the same level of stress or negative impact on my energy. So when I came off the tube this morning, I was like, right, okay, I've got a 10-minute walk to get to the studio. Let's chat to Hugo, who's accompanied me to the studio, who works on the clips in the podcast. Let's have like a kind of chilled, positive conversation to shift state from the negativity of the tube. And I'm not shitting on the tube. It's a very important resource to get us around, but it's not the kind of place you want to spend a lot of time.
No.
And I can tell you right now that I function on a very high level because I try and have variables in my life that don't bring my energy down like that.
Yes.
And I came off and I was like, right, time to reset.
Yep.
If I was doing that every day, I would struggle with that.
And I think that there's two key parts to that. First is you understand the levers that you can pull, right? So if you understand that you've got this fairly high intensity commute, then you might change a lever down the line. Might go, right, then it's maybe not a day for a super high intensity workout today. So I'll do more of a zone 2 in nature, chill out workout. I'll offset that in the same way as I might have a terrible meal earlier, but I can offset it with a more, nutrient abundant meal later. And I think this is what we really talk about health literacy is there's no singular thing that's good or bad for you universally. There is being able to apply mostly good things. And that requires you to understand what the rules of the game are. And when you know the rules of the game, you realize that then you've got multiple tools to offset things. So you don't have to avoid the tube. You just need to offset the tube. And if that's 1 day out of 7, that's no burden. If you're doing that, 6 days a week for 3 years, and then you're suddenly wondering why your capacity at work's gone down, you didn't know that commute was causing a major part of your progressive burnout. And I think, so there's the first part is this sort of, when you know the rules of the game, it's easier to play. And most people don't know the rules of the game. They don't understand the correlation between behaviors and physiology and feeling. And that's a really important pyramid. My behaviors affect my physiology, and that will manifest as how I feel. Energy being one expression of that.
Awareness is such an important skill.
Yeah.
And I think some people walk around on autopilot far too often.
Yeah.
And that's a big, big risk that we come up against. When it comes to things like me being on that tube this morning and recognizing in my own body that my stress was up, I had key things that I knew that I could do straight away off the back of it that meant that I would get back into the sort of state that I want to be in to do a podcast like this and the 3 others that we've got planned for after this. And having those things, like, again, I've got cheesy phrases like motion is lotion. So I went for I would have happily walked a little bit more before I got to the studio because I was feeling good. I was feeling verbose. Yes. I can have little triggers that I can switch to. So I can put in particular music that I listen to before I public speak, or particular music that I listen to before I podcast, or I could listen to another episode that you've been on so I feel more prepped for it and it relaxes me. Yeah. I sat downstairs in the cafe and I reviewed my notes that I was going to speak to you and then Dan Tem later on. And that gets me back in a state where I'm ready to rumble.
Yep.
And I hope more people can find those offset habits that get us back to where we want to be.
I totally agree. I think we've got to start with the idea that we're not trying to avoid these situations in many cases. You're trying to manage your pressures this morning because you have an abundance of pressures through the day. So you're saying, look, I already got a pretty big, we would call that sort of phrase load, which would tie into technologies that are measuring this, things like Whoop and things like Aura would describe this as load. But you've got a lot of inputs today. So one extra input may alter your performance through your capability through podcasts. So then you're in that position of saying, okay, I recognize that. So I've got some real-time tools that I can use to offset some of that load. One of which would be low intensity cardio. If that's in nature, that's great. There's some physical elements you can do, which will do that. The most obvious and immediate would be breath work. So breath work is a very robust physiological technique to immediately change my state. And that can change, how I function. You've also got then psychological strategies like saying, okay, I can manage my load in not just by dissipating the impact on my physiology, but by preparing better. And that mental preparation decreases the amount of pressure you'd feel through the podcast you got to do today. Your third area is sort of environment. So when we look at how people manage pressure, I can change the volume of pressures, I can change how many pressures you perceive, and I can change how your body reacts to those pressures. So I've got 3 different layers. And an example there would be, if I change the environment or volume of pressures, I could get an Uber. So if I think the tube is too much, I'll get an Uber. If I think Uber's too much, then I'll record remotely, right? So I can change my world sometimes without having to change my reaction. Point number 2 is what if I view that intense period as an exciting experience? I reframe it and do anything from cognitive behavioral therapy to visualization to other.
Even just swapping the meaning of the words.
Swapping basic changes of the words.
I never get nervous. I want to get excited.
Brilliant.
I hope you enjoyed that clip. For more on my channel, hit the link just here, subscribe, and you can enjoy the full episode.